talking about the upper house and lower house, can you explain the functions of those two chambers and how they impact each other when people vote? The elections are coming up in March, so when people kind of vote more for the upper house or lower house, how does that make a difference to them?
Okay, so important to distinguish. So the WA election,
Yes.
the state election is coming up. Basically, right? In federal, there's the House of Representatives, and then there's the Senate. In state government, there's the Legislative Assembly, and then there's the Legislative Council.
Right.
And these chambers are kind of similar in their function. So basically, the government is formed federally in the House of Representatives. In the state, it's formed in the Legislative Assembly.
Right.
And the makeup of the Senate and the Council can be a little bit different because for, say, the House of Representatives or Legislative Assembly, you're voting for like a group of suburbs called an electorate. So if you live in that area and a party is running in that area, then you can vote for them. Whereas the Senate is for an entire state, and then the Legislative Council is, well, not an entire state, it's for certain areas.
Right.
But there is like multiple candidates that can be elected in an area.
Okay.
So you basically get like a slightly different makeup in these two chambers because the area that people need to like be in to vote for a certain candidate is a lot larger. So if you have people who don't live in the same area, it's a lot harder for them to vote for like a specific candidate in the Legislative Assembly or House of Representatives. So because of the difference in like the area and the way that we vote for the two different chambers, we get a little bit more of like a balance in the types of parties that can be present in one chamber versus the other.
Right.
So for the House of Representatives federally and the Legislative Assembly in the state, they can introduce bills to do with money, whereas the other chamber can't.
Right.
They can both introduce bills. Both chambers can introduce bills. Any member from any party can introduce a bill. So long as you have a member in a chamber, then that party has a voice, basically.
Yeah.
But
only a certain chamber can introduce bills to do with money and finance.
yes,
Right.
yeah. So
Right.
basically, so for like House of Representatives or the Assembly, they put forward like a budget for the Commonwealth or the state, and then the other chamber, the Council or the Senate, is we refer to it as like a chamber of review.
Right.
And so that's where like the government then has to then sometimes debate with other parties. Maybe it has to make compromises because it may not have all the numbers, and so that way there's this sort of like democratic mix of a bunch of other different voices that may be like, oh yes, of course, thank you for this funding for hospitals or roads or whatever.
Schools.
Or,
Yeah.
Or like, no, we don't like these budget cuts.
Right.
Or we may be open to these budget cuts if you like amend certain things.
Right.
And so bills have to pass both houses identically. So a bill can be introduced in one house, then it can be sent to another, and then that chamber or house is like, oh, we like most of it, but we want these few changes, right? And then because it's been changed, has to go back to the original house, and then that house has to approve of those chambers. That house has to approve of those changes. And if they don't, the bill doesn't pass.
Right. Okay.
So there's this back and forth.
Yeah, it makes sense, and I guess that's why it's probably important to have people from different parties represented, because then you can get a balance that makes sense for the whole community or for the whole state, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's important, because if you had a lot of, one particular party, then they won't question each other's bills or changes as much.
Statistically, the government, when we refer to the government, I mean like the ruling party, basically. So like currently, federally, that's the Liberals.
Yes.
They don't control the Senate.
Yes.
And when Labor was in power, they didn't control the Senate either.
Right. So it kind of switches a little bit.
It switches. So basically there's the two major parties that we know, Labour and Liberal.
Yeah.
Whoever is in power is the government. Whoever isn't in power is called the opposition, just because they're the second largest.
Right.
And then everyone else outside of those two big parties is called the crossbench. So you may hear in the news lots of arguments about like whether or not the crossbench will support something.
Right.
So
Definitely heard the front bench and back bench.
Yes.
Not so much. The crossbench hasn't ventured too much in the media.
It's all just different types of benches, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and I understand you were explaining to me earlier that the front bench usually has the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, whereas the back bench, or is that also, it includes the ministers in the front bench?
Yeah. So when I say front bench, the three different type of benches that form government, there's the crossbench, which is everyone who isn't part of the major parties.
Yes.
There is the backbench, which is pretty much most politicians.
Yeah.
And then there is the front bench, which are politicians that have been given what we refer to as a portfolio.
Okay.
So, like Minister for Education, Minister for Health, Minister for Defence,
Yes.
Prime Minister, that sort of thing.
Right.
Those are members of the front bench,
Yeah.
and they just, to put it quite literally, they sit near the front. Probably because they're going to be called on the most, and you don't want to be like yelling from the back
Yeah.
to answer questions about like things. So they are in charge of coming up with policy to do with that particular area.
Right.
They field a lot of questions about that. I mean, parties are democratic in that like the party room will discuss like where they're moving as a party. But like there is extra focus on those ministers
Right.
to deal with those areas.
Yes. Well, coming back to the two chambers or to the state elections for WA in March, is there a bit of an overlap between those over the region, between the the upper house and the lower house, where I think the upper house, the Senate's, there's like 6 large territories,
Yeah.
right? And then there is, obviously, in the lower house, there's I think 38 or 36 or something like this, electorals.
Electorates.
Electorates.
Yeah.
Electoralites. Because it's completely a different language to me.
I've screwed up saying electorates so many times.
Right.
It's a bit of a tongue twister.
You know, you got to kind of understand. The paper sounds like you're going to a ballet, right? When you go to the voting booths, and you got to choose which ballot paper. It sounds like ballet to me.
Yeah.
Do you think the language is designed to confuse people, just to make things more interesting?
It's one of the like language like naturally evolves, and the problem with like political language is that once it's been set down,
Right.
it doesn't really change as much. So like there's so many traditions that we've got from the Westminster system, which is like hundreds of years old.
Yes.
Like,
And so people don't probably question it because they're like, we've done this, we've always done it this way, so we're going to continue to do it. We're not going to change it.
yeah, we've got a position called the Sergeant at Arms,
Yes,
which
right.
is keeping the peace in the chamber.
Yes.
It's not spelled at all like it should be.
Right.
Like, and then there's the Keeper of the Black Rod, like that literally just has a black rod.
Right. These are positions in Parliament.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, Keeper of the Black Rod is in the Senate.
And what's his role? I'd love to know. He just holds the black rod and hangs out.
There's some ceremonial duties, but also like they're meant to keep order within the chamber.
Right. So you've got
In
the
a
sergeant.
sort of like a security sense. Like there's the president of the Senate who is actually like running
Right.
like the like a manager basically, like, oh, we're going to discuss this bill, or like you're talking too much, sit down, that sort of thing. And then the Keeper of the Black Rod,
He'll smack you with it.
yeah, pretty much. Like I feel like the original archaic role was like I literally have a weapon.
I could take you out the back.
yeah. Do not be disorderly.
Right.
But like a lot of these have just turned into like really formal, baked in traditions
Right.
that we just have because the English had them hundreds of years ago, and they still have them.
Right. I mean, with respect to our politics, there's a lot of peace in there. They do get a bit passionate and sort of raise their voice, but I've never seen anybody sort of get up and punch anyone or throw a shoe at someone. It's not like those other countries that we've seen, the European countries or some countries that get really heated and turn it into a fist fight. So probably, I don't know, maybe we could remove some of those sergeant of arms and black rod bearer and things like that. Just trying to keep it humorous here because, like we said at the beginning, it is a very dry topic.
Yeah.
And then add the mixture of the language that makes it almost like a foreign language to us as well. Even as you rightfully said, some of the words are said in a certain way, but they're spelt differently.
Yes, like there's a lot of a member of parliament, you would think MP, usually means House of Representatives, but a member of parliament is a member of any parliament, which means a senator is technically a member of parliament, and the Senate is a house, but when I say the House, I mean the House of Representatives,
right,
because they're both referred to as houses or referred to as chambers, so there's But politics can be either like you have to be specific about the language,
right,
because otherwise, if you don't know what I'm referring to,
yes,
I just said a string of gibberish. It's going to be like, there are two houses, but we refer to this one as just the house. And
I honestly think that that's the barrier that confuses people from understanding politics and even taking an interest in voting, which shapes our future, right?
Yes.
So that's why I really take my hat off and give so much credit to you for doing what you're doing with AUSPOL Explained, because there needs to be a lot of explanations, to inform people and to educate people. So with the recent events, David, I think a lot of people had this question on the top of their mind: what is the difference, or what control does the Prime Minister of Australia have over the state premiers? Because it seems like the state premiers have free reins here to do certain things and create certain lockdowns. And it seems like the Prime Minister is helpless to say, hey, stop that, and, can you get with it? We're not, this is not, Hitler's days. It's a completely different time. Loaded question.
Let's move past the Hitler part. We don't need to. Anyway.
We don't need to bring Hitler into this.
No, we don't. That's completely different. System of government entirely.
Right.
So basically, right, there is a lot of division of power.
Right.
In the Constitution, in Section 51, there is a lot of things that are specifically given to the federal government, because originally there was a lot of colonies who then would become the states. And so they originally had all these powers, and they wrote into the Constitution, they collectively got together and they decided, what is the federal government going to be able to do?
Right.
So the federal government has certain responsibilities, like taxes.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that necessarily
the state doesn't have it.
But the states are allowed taxes because the federal government lets them have taxes, because they need to function and whatnot. But the
states were original, and then they created the federal.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So states can make laws to do with things under Section 51 if the federal government allows it.
Right.
But they're not allowed to contradict federal laws that the government has specific jurisdiction on. But there are certain things that are basically the jurisdiction of the states.
Right.
Which, to be fair, is actually a lot.
Right.
And one of those, it's roads is one of them, but also particularly health.
Right.
So it's the state responsibility to sort of look after the hospitals.
Sure.
And in this case, coronavirus. The federal government has the power of quarantine.
Yes.
So it is allowed to, if it wanted to, it could quarantine all of Australia.
Yes.
Basically, it could, and it also has control over borders, so it's allowed to shut down federal borders and stop people from coming in. But, like I said, health in the majority is a state parliament thing. So, where at the start of the pandemic, Scott Morrison put together what is called the National Cabinet. The National Cabinet has no legislative power. It is just a formal way of saying, I am meeting with all the state premiers and the territory chiefs,
Right.
and would come up together to have some sort of response to this. Because if we have a completely like scattered response and one state is doing like something super important and another one's just like ignoring it entirely, that might ruin it for everyone.
Right.
So to begin with, like, we had them sort of collaborating together.
Right.
But
I heard, just contrary to that, I heard him dismantling that national cabinet.
yes, well, because
Kind of at the
national cabinet it doesn't have any like power by itself.
Right.
And because it still is the individual state premier's responses
Okay.
and responsibilities.
Yes.
Once like we got a little bit further in the pandemic, we saw that like different states were in very different positions.
Right.
Like, because you can't just come up with a federal law for like all of Australia about like how we're going to respond to the coronavirus. Because like in WA, we have
Completely
no
different
yeah.
cases.
If we were like if we had a uniform thing where like, oh, Melbourne's doing really bad, let's lock down everything in WA. It doesn't make sense. That's why like, you know, the states are closer to their people.
Yeah.
They have to come up with their individual responses. So as time progressed, that uniform or attempt to be like uniform,
Collaborative.
yeah, it became less important because the individual circumstances
We're different.
became different.
Right.
And so Scott Morrison is like saying a few things, he's commenting, but he doesn't actually have much power over what like Dan Andrews or Gladys Berejiklian
Right.
like does.
Yes.
Because it's not his responsibility.
Yeah.
So that's basically
Wow.
why, because he
Yeah.
legally just doesn't have that power.
He doesn't have the power to tell them what to do.
Yeah. But it is important to note that things like health, there is a little bit of crossover. Like sometimes there can be a little bit of input between like all three different levels of government. So, like I said, the states have some taxation powers, but they can't fund everything by themselves because
Right.
certain taxes are really most beneficial. Like income tax is a federal thing, and that really helps the government get revenue.
Right.
So then the federal government then gives grants to state governments for hospitals.
Right.
And so hospitals are partially funded by both.
Okay.
So the government can be like, the federal government is like, I know this isn't entirely our responsibility, we won't be managing it, but it is in part of good governance to ensure that the states have the funding that they need to do what they want.
Makes sense.
Yes, so then they give grants on hospitals. The
Yeah.
states have also raised some revenue themselves. Collectively, then goes into managing some hospitals.
Sure.
And then there's also some local government input on like very specific areas to do with health, like waste management. And so it, like collectively,
Yeah.
some things are like the jurisdiction of state government, but collectively, all three levels of government have like a little bit of like a Venn diagram crossover where they can contribute
Right.
input or potentially even have like a say in what happens. Comparison, right? Say like the Northern Territory and the Australian Capital Territory, they have their own little government,
Right.
but anything that they say can be overridden by a federal government
Right.
at all.
For the territories, not for the states.
Only for the territories. So
Yeah.
like if a state comes in, like for example, Victoria had assisted dying laws that have come in.
Yes.
The federal government doesn't have a say in that. So those are law. They're very restrictive laws, but that's basically what the parliament decided, and that's what the people are okay with.
Right.
Whereas, historically in the 90s, the Northern Territory came in and was like, hey, we would love to have assisted dying laws. And then they tried to pass that, but then the federal government was like, no, we don't want that to happen. So they came in and just undid that.
Right.
So mostly territories, the mainland territories govern themselves, with every now and again a little bit of oversight from the federal government, whereas the states get to govern themselves, and a lot of things the federal government doesn't have a say in.
Well, that makes sense. And so you know, basically, in short, Scott Morrison can have more of a say on the territories and overrule their decisions in some cases or their laws. It doesn't always happen, but it can. But on the states, that doesn't happen.
Yes, they the federal government mostly just leaves the territories alone. It's just simple. It's just certain laws that they find controversial. So, for instance, recently the ACT was like, we want to legalize weed.
Right.
And the federal government was like, we don't want you to do that.
Right.
So it's those sort of like issues that have a little bit of like moral or social controversy that the federal government like decides to have an input on.
Right.
Whereas like other things like, oh, how are you going to manage this road, etc. Like the federal government, the federal government is allowed to have input on how the Northern Territory deals with its roads, but they're not going to bother that much because the Northern Territory, they're close to the people. They're right there. They know how to deal with certain things. So it's not like a big worry that you're living in the Northern Territory and you're like, the federal government just comes in and just knocks over all our laws. Like it's just an element of how those two governments are different and how like a territory doesn't have the same power as a state.
Makes sense. Thank you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome.
David, it's been an absolute pleasure. And in wrapping up, how do people find you and learn more about AUSPOL Explained?
Well, you just simply search for AUSPOL Explained on YouTube, or check out the link in the description, and I will teach you everything you need to know about Australian politics. Like, everything. I do not shut up about Australian politics.
Well, I'm glad to see someone with so much passion and with a bit of sense of humour and creativity in presenting such a dry topic. You make it sound fun.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks for your time. Cheers.